United States. Now, we decided that we'd stay on the very hot and emotional topic of migration and immigration. And so we'll kick off with this first segment by having a look at how immigration in this country is presented by the media. This is just one of many clips. Let's have a look.
Proof deterrents aren't working as the number of channel crossings tip over 10,000. A new record for this stage in the year as nearly 300 migrants risked their lives on Friday.
You're in the middle of the sea, you look left and right, you don't see any hard thing, right? And almost the water just, getting in the boat.
Kolbasia knows the desperation. He fled in the same way from torture years ago. He helps other victims and says UK politics won't stop the boats.
We know the crossing is dangerous, but we do it anyway because we know that that's the only option that we have. There's nothing that can stop us in order to get somewhere where we feel that we need to get to be safe.
Rishi Sunak's reputation and possibly the election depends on getting immigration under control. But Rwanda deportation flights have been paused. This accommodation there still empty.
We're seeing people who've fled brutal regimes, oppressive wars, who are in limbo. They're not being processed. They're not going to be removed. And all of that means that their accommodation costs will carry on rising. And so whoever wins the next election, this will be the immediate priority. The system is heading for meltdown.
Migration also tricky for Labour. The voters it needs to win back want tougher controls. Keir Starmer promises a border security command.
But nothing has worked so far, and they'll all have to convince people that theirs is the plan that finally makes a difference. There's also a lot of scepticism that Labour will do any better. But immigration is one of the top issues voters care about, so they'll have to.
The Home Office said we continue to work closely with our French partners to prevent crossings and save lives.
So that's a typical news report. What does it try and suggest? It suggests that the problem is simply with immigration as a result of people in rubber boats. There's a few hundred of them. There's thousands of them coming, but that's simply the problem. But of course, that is not the problem because the boat crossings are a tiny, tiny fraction of the overall migration into the country, which is a much more complicated thing to look at, and we're going to try and do that today. Now, Debbie, you came up with another video clip here, which is fascinating. Tell us about it.
I did, yes, and I've got a little segment on migration too, which we'll come on to. But while I was looking, I found a very interesting documentary from ARTE, art.tv documentaries, and they've been following migrants in the channel. And I want to introduce you to a slightly different side of the coin. I want to introduce you to Aladdin, who doesn't have a genie, sadly, and Mahmoud. And they are currently in Dover. Have a look at this.
This is a new phenomenon on the English coast. Like Mohammed, more and more are making the return journey. Those let down by the English dream. The young man shares the beach with two friends, Mahmoud, a 26-year-old from Jordan, and Aladdin from Syria. Aladdin arrived in Britain 3 years ago and applied for asylum, but like thousands of others in the country, he is yet to receive a reply. Without documents, he can neither work nor settle. He has no prospects, no life. He decided to leave the hotel he was staying in and has now been living on the beach for 6 months.
I was thinking I'm gonna get my own house, my own room, my own flat. I'm gonna get a job. I'm gonna get I'm gonna do a license. I'm gonna get a nice life. But no, you go to London, you find too many homeless people when they are in the same situation. But actually, they're scared to go back home, to go back to his country, because he ran away from war. Just stay here and die here. No, I don't want to die here. I don't want to die in your country.
So that's a very different story. And what does it show? Well, it shows, of course, chaos actually in UK, that we can't deal with the problem, but also these people are essentially being used for an agenda. And we're going to come on to that agenda. Let's look at the figures again. We've shown this one before, but let's put it on screen. So this is from the government. Detections at the border, it calls this, by methods of entry. And if you look at small boat arrivals, which is the strongest line on the graph, we're talking in thousands, up to 15,000, up to 20,000 at one point there in 2022. So it sounds a huge amount, but of course we should have a look at this against the massive total for 1 year of over 600,000. Now, the language is important because they talk about irregular immigration by rubber boats. And Debbie in a minute is going to talk in a lot more detail about this manipulation of terminology and language, we believe, in order to make an opaque system to migration and immigration so that the public really doesn't understand what's going on. Now, a big thank you to a viewer who actually sent me this clip. It's from the Sun newspaper. It's going back to May the 7th, 2005. The big headline is, "I'll give you 5, Rattled Blair unveils plan." He'd been re-elected for the 3rd time, I think it was, but he was suffering with a drop of support amongst Labour voters. But here was his 5 pledges. And number 4 was, quote, to sort out the immigration crisis. The immigration chaos. Now, if we look in the article itself, he said that he'd learned the British are a tolerant and decent people. I think that's a fair statement. But they believe there are real problems in our immigration and asylum system, and they expect us, that's New Labour under Tony Blair, to sort them out. And we will. That's what he said in May 2005. Let's have a look at a couple of clips of Blair speaking on the subject of immigration.
Thank you very much indeed, Digby, and thank you to the CBI and to the London Business School for allowing me to come and make this lecture to you today. And I thank all of you for coming and listening to what is an important subject. Now, I have to say it's one of those subjects where when you tell your senior civil service that you're about to make a speech on a subject like immigration, they say, what a courageous move, Prime Minister. But there it is. Anyway, here goes. Immigration and politics do not make easy bedfellows. They never have. We need few reminders of what can happen when the politics of immigration gets out of hand. And let us also be very clear that those who warned of disaster back in the 1960s and 1970s if migration was not stopped, who said Britain would never accept or be a multiracial society, have been proved comprehensively wrong. On the other hand, there is no doubt that on the doorstep in local communities, immigration has suddenly become very high in the agenda. Why? It is not, incidentally, an exclusively British issue. This is a worldwide phenomenon. Immigration has dominated elections in countries like Denmark, Austria, and the Netherlands in recent years. Le Pen rose to prominence in France, as we know. In Australia and New Zealand, it has been a central question, sharply dividing the main parties. Migration flows across the world with increased opportunities to travel, and globalization are driving the issue.
So he did actually tell the truth at the end. This isn't a national problem. This is a problem that's been created by the desire for global government, and the migration of people globally is a key weapon in helping create that government. Let's look at the second little clip from his speech.
And beneath the surface, I think we all know as politicians, certainly on the centre left, what we fear: that concern slips into prejudice and becomes racism. But we cannot simply dismiss any concern about immigration as racism. In part, what has put immigration back up the agenda, with public concern at its highest since the 1970s, is that there are real, not imagined, abuses of the system that lead to a sense of genuine unfairness. There were real problems with asylum. Some immigration procedures have clearly been at fault. Some rules introduced for entirely legitimate reasons have been subject to systematic, often criminal fraud. And many of these systems simply need bringing up to date. Then there are high-profile examples of the absurd, not many in number, but very damaging in terms of impact, like radical clerics coming here to preach religious hate, or people staying here to peddle support for terrorism. The combination of all these things, with the reporting of them not exactly calculated to douse the flames of concern, lead to a crunch point, and that, frankly, is where we are now. The vast bulk of the British people are not racist. It is in their nature to be moderate. But they expect government to respond to their worries. They can accept migration that is controlled and selective. They accept and welcome migrants who play by the rules. But they will not accept abuse or absurdity, and indeed, why should they? So I think now is the time to make the argument for controlled migration simultaneous with tackling the abuses we can identify, and then longer term put in place a system that gives us the best guarantee of future integrity in our migration policy. That is why we have begun a top-to-bottom analysis of the immigration system, how it operates, how it can be improved, how it can agree migration where it is in our country's interests and prevent it where it isn't. One thing I should say to you is already clear. The overwhelming majority migrate in, and indeed often out of Britain, fairly and in accordance with the rules. But there are areas of abuse, and we can and should deal with them.
So what he didn't do is say that he was going to put a stop to inappropriate immigration. What he was actually doing was spelling out the real policy, which was for an increase in it. Now, we've shown some of this material before. We do this very quickly. This is the immigration legacy of Tony Blair, and it's showing just some of the policies that he brought in to supposedly deal with immigration. But what was the result from the time that he came into power in 1997, where we had a net flow into the country of 50,000, by 2004-5, it was up to 200,000. So clearly what he said to the public was a lie. And then if we start to have a look at the UK paperwork, the policy documents on immigration, this is where we start to see the strange use of language here. So it's talking about irregular migration. What is irregular migration? It's unlawful migration. And the unlawful migration has not been in rubber boats, because that is such a tiny percentage. The real movement of people up to over 600,000 has come through government-approved migration, which has been a decision that governments, Labour and Conservative, have made without any discussion with the public. And where have their policies come from? Men like this, Sir Peter Sutherland, who I believe, Mark, that you had the pleasure of meeting briefly some years ago.
Yeah, good day, everyone. Yeah, 10 years ago at a Trilateral Commission meeting in Washington, D.C., I happened to get into that meeting. It was semi-open to the public, and I had a brief debate in front of some of his friends with Peter Sutherland. Not exactly a pleasant guy, but a smart guy. Of course, he was head of the World Trade Organization, and I argued, why should Japan grow rice only to export it and then import someone else's rice? And he gave this rather tortuous answer. But I concluded that people like this, moving people around and moving produce around or goods and services, is all the same to them. In other words, they commoditize people, and people are encouraged to migrate and move around the globe in accordance with economic aspirations of the globalists. That's what I got out of it.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Well, if we just pop Peter Sutherland back on screen, the organisation that he was then head of, he's now deceased, but he was then head of the Global Forum on Migration and Development. And what was he saying? That migration would be used to break down the nation state. If we actually have a look at that Global Forum on Migration and Development, this is about bringing nations together to discuss immigration and migration. And if we look at it in very simple terms, this is the killer statement: the contribution of migration to sustainable development. So migration and immigration is being used as a weapon for the sustainable development policies in the world. And we've got dynamic multi-stakeholder dialogue. This is the high-level discussions beyond government, where people like Tony Blair were told what the migration policies were due to be.